What happens when arrogance collides with hidden brilliance in the most opulent corner of New York City? The story begins not with grandeur, but with a single sentence, sharp enough to cut through chandeliers and velvet curtains. It was uttered at Aurelia, a restaurant where fortunes were flaunted, not in the numbers on bank statements, but in the rituals of dining. A place where wine lists resembled sacred texts, and menus were treated as scripture. The voice that broke the hush was heavy with money and cruelty. The target was not another magnate or rival, but a young waitress carrying plates with the quiet dignity of someone whose mind was sharper than the knives that clinked on porcelain. The night had started with the usual choreography of Aurelia silver gleamed under candlelight, chairs slid across marble floors like whispers. Patrons of old money settled into their roles effortlessly, their words flowing as smoothly as the wines they ordered. Every detail was designed to remind the world of permanence and power, and yet into this carefully curated silence a discordant note rose. A man with too much noise in his soul, a mogul named Victor Kane, leaned back in his leather booth. The gold at his wrist caught the light as though it had its own spotlight. His laugh was guttural, his presence a performance to dominate the room. Across from him, his companions smiled on cue. A young wife, sculpted to perfection by wealth, stared at her phone, bored with both food and husband, while a subordinate chuckled with nervous eagerness at every clumsy joke Kane unleashed. The night into this theater of vanity stepped Elena Marlowe. She carried the weight of silver trays and the heavier weight of unpaid hospital bills. Her uniform was black tailored severe, yet beneath it burned the intellect of a scholar who had once immersed herself in 17th century French verse. Her evenings in Aurelia were supposed to be invisible. A smile here, a nod there, a vessel, not a voice. And yet the night was fated to be different. Fate does not always announce itself. It sometimes arrives as a sneer. Patriarch Cree for the menu, his thick fingers adorned with rings tracing words he could not pronounce. He was the kind of man who treated culture as an accessory, a trinket to be worn and discarded. A dish written in elegant French caught his eye. He smirked, rolled the syllables around, and spat them out mangled like cheap wine. Elena, standing beside him, felt her spine stiffen. The training drilled into her required that she neither flinch nor frown. She must only nod. She did, but her silence also was noted. Kane's eyes narrowed. The predator had scented prey. The meal carried on with a cruel rhythm, each course another opportunity for Kane to assert dominance. His steak was too red, his asparagus too limp. His voice carried across the gilded dining room like a judge delivering sentences. His subordinate Miles echoed every word as if approval were oxygen. The young wife Claudia raised her eyes only to frame her face for another filtered photograph. Through it all, Elena endured. Every apology was smooth, every gesture precise. Still, in her heart, each insult landed like a stone dropped into a well, deepening the reservoir of quiet rage. It was during the pause between courses when Kane chose his weapon. He leaned back, placed the menu flat, and raised his voice just enough for surrounding tables to hear. "You know," he said with a lazy venom, "I doubt she can even read this menu." The words were not thrown in jest. They were delivered with the casual brutality of someone accustomed to unquestioned power. Laughter caught in Miles' throat before spilling out, brittle and wrong. Claudia lowered her phone, surprised at last. Every fork and glass in the room seemed to halt, as though the entire restaurant had inhaled and held its breath. The insult did more than question Elena's competence. It denied her existence as a thinking being, reducing her to a pair of hands, a body to ferry dishes, nothing more. In that moment, the chandeliers gleamed with a crueler light. The whispers that had filled the corners of Aurelia fell silent. The diners turned their heads, wealthy faces tilted toward the spectacle. They had seen men humiliate staff before, but rarely with such open venom. This was no longer about dinner. This was theater, high-stakes theater, and Elena had been cast against her will. Her pulse pounded against her skin. Her jaw tightened. The years she had traded libraries for late shifts, the papers she had abandoned for plates, the mother whose frail body fought disease while hospital bills mounted, all of it surged inside her, forming a single ember of defiance. Victor Kane expected her to wither. He expected her to bow her head, murmur apologies, and scurry back into silence. He expected her to be the ghost she had been trained to become. Instead, what hovered in the pause after his insult was something else. A possibility. A choice. A moment when the overlooked could no longer remain unseen. And as the room held its collective breath waiting for her collapse, Elena Marlowe straightened her back, drew in a deliberate breath, and prepared not to crumble, but to rise. Aurelia was no ordinary restaurant. It was a cathedral to wealth and presentation carved into the heart of Manhattan's Upper East Side. The moment guests stepped through its doors, they were transported from the restless chaos of the city into an atmosphere choreographed to perfection. Every element, from the golden chandeliers imported from Vienna to the velvet drapes lining the windows, whispered of privilege and exclusivity. The air itself felt curated, infused with the faint aroma of truffle oil and aged wine, as though luxury could be distilled into a scent. The dining room was a theater in which patrons played their roles with meticulous precision. Men of old money leaned back in leather chairs speaking in low tones about mergers and acquisitions, their words softened by the forgiving light. Women with jeweled wrists and practiced expressions dissected the challenges of renovating Hampton's estates or planning charity galas, meant to signal generosity while disguising competition. The soundscape was delicate, a symphony of crystal glasses clinking against porcelain plates, silverware brushing quietly across handmade linens. Even silence here was not empty but deliberate. A performance designed to convey power without raising a voice. Into this stage, Elena Marlowe moved like a shadow. Her uniform was a fitted black suit tailored sharp to hide fatigue and shield her from humiliation. At 27, she carried herself with the quiet grace of someone trained not to disturb. She was there to be efficient, invisible. Her presence acknowledged only in the satisfaction of others, plates being refilled, glasses stopped, and orders taken. Yet behind her calm expression, her mind still bore the imprint of libraries and classrooms. She had once wrestled with 17th century French texts, debated their meaning under the dim lights of university halls, translated poetry so intricate it demanded entire nights of careful thought. Now her brilliance was folded behind the facade of a polite smile and steady hands. Every step she took was powered by necessity, not choice. Her mother, once a history teacher who filled their modest New Jersey apartment with books, was now confined to a hospital bed, tethered to machines whose costs rose higher than Elena's hope could often reach. Those bills had swallowed her doctorate scholarship, leaving her with trays. Not texts with aching feet, but rather academic debates. She loved her mother fiercely, and each shift at Aurelia was an act of survival and devotion. She was no longer chasing glory in academia. She was chasing another month of treatment, another week of life. The irony was cruel. Aurelia was filled with patrons who would never know the weight of a medical bill, who treated a $1,000 bottle of wine as casually as water. For them, dinner was ritual theater performed under glittering lights. For Elena, each tray carried to the table was a sacrifice, each nod of deference a reminder of what she had lost. She had watched men sip vintages while deciding the fate of hundreds of employees. She had seen women nibble salads while sighing about the burden of wealth. Their casual indulgences pressed down on her shoulders with every order, yet she smiled, because smiles were part of the uniform. On that particular evening, the stage felt more charged than usual. There was a hum in the air, Not from the chandeliers, but from a table in the corner where Victor Kane held court. He was not old money. He was not refined. He was disruption masquerading as elegance. His skyscrapers cut into the skyline like weapons. His reputation was that of a brute force conqueror rather than a patron of culture. And yet, his wealth bought him a place at Aurelia's velvet tables. The staff whispered his name when he arrived. A veteran waiter muttered a warning good luck. He's a two-bottle Bordeaux and no-tip type of man. Elena accepted the table without complaint. Her life had trained her to face storms silently. Kane radiated arrogance with every gesture. His watch glinted deliberately, each flick of his wrist a reminder of its cost. His voice rose above the quiet in bursts that turned heads, reminding everyone that his presence demanded attention. His companions were satellites orbiting his wealth. Claudia, his young wife, sculpted into beauty by money, scrolled through her phone with detached boredom. Miles Rowan, his junior associate, echoed his laughter with mechanical precision.
Elena approached their table with the same composure she carried for every patron. Her voice was steady, her smile measured. She offered the wine list, bowed her head slightly, and waited. Kane barely looked at her, snapping his fingers dismissively as though summoning a servant from another era. He stumbled over the French names, sneering when he saw her expressionless face. The correction she offered was subtle, almost invisible. Still, he noticed, and his eyes narrowed. He was the kind of man who interpreted knowledge as a challenge, and challenge as a threat. The meal continued its performance. Kane criticized the steak for being too red, the asparagus for being too limp. His sighs were theatrical, his displeasure broadcast to the room. Miles joined the chorus, clapping invisible hands. Claudia took selfies, as though to escape the table entirely. Elena absorbed it all with silence. Each apology was smooth, each movement exact, but inside her chest, the ember of anger warmed. She thought of her mother lying alone in a hospital bed. At the same time, these men casually wasted food and money. She thought of her lost nights of scholarship traded for compliance with men like him. By the time the menu returned for the main course, the atmosphere had shifted. Kane was restless. He had been building to something. The table was his stage. Elena was the chosen prop. His companions leaned forward instinctively as though sensing the spectacle about to unfold. The entire restaurant seemed to quiet with anticipation. Without knowing it, the diners had become witnesses, an audience waiting for the clash between arrogance and unseen brilliance. And Elena, standing tall with a tray in her hands, felt the balance of her entire life tip precariously toward the inevitable moment to come. I criticized had clawed his way into the city's elite, not through grace or inheritance, but through sheer force and spectacle. He was not born into old money, nor welcomed by those who had been raised in its rituals. His rise was a story of concrete steel and audacity. He built towers not for beauty, but for dominance. Glass and stone sharpened into monuments to himself. Where others spoke in whispers, he boomed. Where others concealed, he flaunted. His presence in Aurelia was not seamless like the patricians who moved as though the chandeliers were hung for their ancestors. His presence was an invasion. He wanted not only to be in the room, but to own it. He wore a watch that could pay off Elena's entire student debt in a single gleam. He gestured with it frequently, flashing its weight as though the shimmer could buy respect. The fabric of his suit was perfect, but it hung on him like armor, stretched across a man more interested in intimidation than refinement. Kane had money, but not class, and he knew it. His entire life was a campaign to disguise that truth. When he was younger, before the skyscrapers, before the private jets, he had been humiliated by an old money host at a gala, mispronouncing a French phrase and being laughed at in front of men he desperately wanted to join. That memory hardened into rage, and from that night forward, he decided if he could not blend into their world, he would batter it down and replace it with his own. Beside him, at Aurelia, sat Claudia, his third wife. She was beautiful in the way money makes possible. Her features symmetrical, her skin polished, her smile precise. She was younger than Kane by 2 decades and carried herself with the detached ennui of someone who lived in gilded cages. Her phone was her shield, scrolling through curated feeds while her husband thundered on. She was there to be seen but not heard, and she played the role flawlessly. Across was Miles Rowan, the junior partner at Kane's firm. His spine seemed to have been surgically removed, leaving him pliable to every command. He laughed before Kane finished his jokes, nodded vigorously at every proclamation, and leaned in as if proximity might translate into power. Miles had built his career not on talent but on sycophancy. His loyalty was not to the truth, still to Kane's approval. His eyes flicked constantly, gauging the temperature of his patron's mood and adjusting his reactions accordingly. Together, they formed the triangle of wealth, vanity, and submission. Kane the conqueror, Claudia the trophy, Miles the servant. Each of them filled the table with an energy that warped the air around it. Patrons nearby ate in polite discomfort, their ears filled with Kane's booming voice, their eyes pulled toward the performance they could not ignore. This was Kane's favorite arena, a hushed room filled with those who prided themselves on quiet restraint. Into that silence, he inserted his noise, his vulgarity, his disdain. It made him feel not only included, but superior. Powerless Marlowe watched this tableau with the composure drilled into her, but she catalogued each detail beneath the surface. She saw that Claudia's indifference was a performance, a silent withdrawal from a man she had married for status but no longer respected. She noticed how Miles flinched at Kane's sudden movements, too eager to cover fear with laughter. She saw Kane himself, a man at war, not with her, but with the invisible aristocracy that had once scorned him. He was not mocking her inability to read the menu. He was reenacting his own humiliation, transferring it to anyone weaker within reach. The irony was bitter. Kane's obsession with dominance revealed his insecurity more clearly than any insult could. He needed to belittle others because in his mind he was still the boy laughed at in a borrowed suit at a party where he did not belong. Every cruel word, every sneer was a shield against the knowing certainty that money had bought him entry, but never acceptance. In Aurelia, among chandeliers and silverware, he was loud precisely because he feared silence. Silence reminded him of those who could exist in refinement effortlessly, while he remained an outsider cloaked in wealth. Elena had seen men like him before. Hedge fund managers who destroyed hundreds of jobs with a shrug. Socialites who belittled staff to affirm their worth. Still, Victor Kane was different. He did not just play the role of arrogance. He embodied it with such intensity that the atmosphere bent around him. Each complaint, each gesture was designed to stage a battle in which he would always win, until tonight, when he chose to aim his insecurities at her. She could already feel the pressure building, the inevitability of confrontation. As Kane flipped through the heavy, leather-bound menu, stumbling over French words with theatrical disdain, Elena felt her pulse quicken, not from fear but from recognition. She understood this man. She recognized the cracks in his performance. He was a tyrant built on fragile foundations. His power was loud but not unshakable. His cruelty was sharp but not invincible. And though she had not yet spoken, the moment was approaching when his mask would slip, when the scholar, hidden beneath her uniform, would step forward to meet the mogul who wanted to own the room. The evening unfolded with the cruel rhythm of a predator testing its prey. Victor Kane leaned back in his seat, commanding attention with every careless gesture. His laughter traveled across the gilded dining room, disturbing the hushed rituals of Aurelia. Patrons paused mid-sentence, their eyes flicking toward him, but none dared to confront him. Kane thrived in that discomfort. He relished the way his arrogance filled the space and left no room for anyone else. Elena Marlowe,
approached the table with a tray balanced carefully in her hands. Her face remained composed. Still, her eyes missed nothing. Her colleague had warned her that Kane was the kind of guest who left scars, not tips. He began his performance almost immediately, snapping his fingers for the wine list without so much as a glance in her direction. The gesture was sharp, dismissive, a reminder that in his eyes she was furniture, not flesh. Elena placed the leather-bound tome in front of him with quiet precision, offering a soft, "Of course, sir." He scanned the list, lips barging over French syllables. "Confiscated. Get me," he demanded, stumbling on the name of a famed vintage. The way he twisted the word made the delicate sounds into something guttural. Petras. The hiss of the final S hung in the air. Elena did not flinch. She answered smoothly, her voice even. "The 2005 Petrus is indeed a remarkable choice." She pronounced it correctly, every vowel clear, every consonant subtle. The correction was quiet, almost invisible. Still, Kane heard it. His eyes flickered, narrowing for a heartbeat before the smirk returned. He had been challenged in a language he barely grasped, and the sting lodged deep. That was the first cut. It was small, deliberate, delivered without malice, yet it pierced the armor he wore so loudly. Kane covered the wound with bravado, gesturing to his companions. Claudia remained absorbed in her phone, pretending not to notice. Miles barked out a laugh, half a second too late, trying to erase the moment with noise. But Kane carried it with him like a thorn lodged under the skin. The meal became a steak arrived rare as requested. Still, he pushed it back with exaggerated disgust. "Too bloody," he announced. His voice rose loud enough for neighboring tables to hear. The asparagus was next dismissed as limp. His complaints were theatrical sighs punctuated with the sweeping gestures. Each time Elena returned to the table she met his disdain with calm apologies. "I will have the chef prepare another for you immediately, sir." "My apologies, sir. I will replace it at once." Her tone never cracked. Her face betrayed irritation. Yet, with every unflappable response, Kane grew more unsettled. He was a man who feasted on weakness. He wanted panic in her eyes, fluster in her hands. He wanted her to stumble so he could relish his superiority. But Elena gave him nothing. Her discipline was a mirror reflecting his own pettiness at him. The more she withheld, the more he pressed. The predator had scented resistance, and that resistance stoked his fury. Claudia lifted her eyes from her phone for the briefest moment, watching the dynamic unfold. She saw her husband's booming displeasure bouncing off Elena's placid mask. For the first time that night, her expression shifted ever so slightly from boredom to intrigue. She had married Kane for wealth and status, but she knew his insecurities too well. Here was a waitress, half her age, who refused to bend, and it unsettled him. Miles, meanwhile, leaned forward over the table, nodding at every word Kane uttered. "Inexcusable, Victor. Your standards are higher." He spoke the lines of a loyal understudy, rehearsed and eager, but his voice trembled with the effort. The tension at the table thickened course by course like a storm gathering unseen. Pressure, Elena carried plates and refilled glasses, but beneath her calm surface, her pulse quickened. She thought of her mother alone in the hospital room, fighting for every breath. She thought of the hours she had once spent with poetry and history, the brilliance she had buried beneath servitude. Each sneer from Kane pressed against those memories until they glowed hot. Her silence was not weakness. It was a coiled spring waiting for release. Around the restaurant, the atmosphere shifted. Other diners noticed the imbalance. They watched Kane's loudness clash against Elena's restraint. They saw a battle forming, though no voices were raised beyond his. Each sigh, each insult, each correction of hers invisible to most was sharpening the line between arrogance and dignity. The air itself seemed to wait. By the time the main course was due to be ordered, Cain had grown restless. His complaints had failed to break her composure. His arrogance had not bent her. He drummed his fingers on the polished table, tapping out an impatient rhythm. His eyes lingered on Elena each time she passed, not with appreciation, but with calculation. He was searching for the blow that would shatter her mask. He wanted the grand humiliation, the scene that would remind the room of his dominance. Elena felt it too. She sensed the gathering force, like thunder rolling just beyond the horizon. She had endured his first cuts, silent and steady, but she knew the night was bending toward a moment she could not escape. Cain was preparing the strike, and the restaurant, Aurelia, with all its chandeliers and velvet curtains, was about to witness it. The room seemed to slow as Victor Cain leaned back in his seat, the heavy leather groaning beneath his weight. He flipped the menu open again, his thick fingers dragging over the delicate French names like claws through silk. He was restless, unsatisfied that his barbs had not pierced Elena Marlowe's calm exterior. The steak, the asparagus, the endless petty complaints had not cracked her. She had smiled, bowed her head, and answered with a serenity that only deepened his irritation. He was looking for something bigger, something that would not just bruise her pride, but shatter it. His companions sensed the moment Claudia finally set her phone down, her glossy lips parting with the faintest flicker of curiosity. Miles Rowan leaned forward, anticipation flashing in his eager eyes. He had seen Cain orchestrate these performances before, moments where a simple employee was reduced to rubble with a few choice words. It was not conversation, it was spectacle. Cain thrived on the hush that followed cruelty, the satisfaction of watching a room bear witness to his dominance. The menu trembled slightly in his hands, though not from nerves, but from the performance of a man about to pounce. He chose a dish notorious for its complexity, a traditional French preparation, rarely ordered in. Aurelia precisely because it demanded both precision in the kitchen and fluency in the language of the menu. His voice rose, cutting across the velvet quiet of the dining room. "I'll have the..." He stumbled deliberately over the syllables, contorting them into an ugly parody. "Rognon de veau à la Dijonnaise" became a guttural snarl from his mouth. He paused, savoring the moment before lifting his gaze to Elena. The pause was long enough to draw eyes. Heads turned discreetly from nearby tables. Forks froze above porcelain glasses hovered midway between hand and lip. Aurelia, the sanctuary of refined discretion, had become an arena. Cain's grin widened, smug and poisonous. He flicked the menu with a dismissive gesture, loud enough for his words to carry across the room. "You know what he said?" his voice dripping with contempt. "I doubt she can even read this menu." The insult cracked through the dining room sharper than the chime of crystal. A murmur rippled, then died as silence rushed in. Patrons glanced at each other, brows lifting in disbelief. Some stiffened, uncomfortable. Others leaned forward, compelled by the drama. The weight of every eye shifted toward the corner table, toward the billionaire who had just reduced a waitress to nothing, and the young woman who now stood at the center of his cruelty. Claudia tilted her head, her expression betraying the first spark of genuine interest in the evening. Her eyes flicked between her husband and the waitress, as though studying a duel. Miles chuckled, a wet, nervous sound, hoping to amplify Cain's ridicule. He failed to notice the tremor in his own voice. Cain, however, was focused entirely on Elena. His eyes glittered with malice. His smirk dared her to respond.
He wanted to strip her of her poise, to turn her invisible composure into ashes before an audience. For Elena, the words landed like a physical blow. Heat rushed up her neck into her cheeks. Her body stiffened. For an instant, the years of training, the drilled in obedience, the walls she had carefully built, threatened to collapse. He had done what others had only implied. He had declared her unworthy of intellect, unworthy of identity. She was no longer a scholar forced into uniform, no longer a woman carrying the burden of debt and a sick mother. She was a prop in his theater of humiliation. In her mind, the sacrifices reeled like ghosts. The long nights in libraries traded for aching feet. The academic debates exchanged for the clink of glass. The hospital bills mounting with every shift. Every condescension, every whisper, every time she had swallowed her pride to endure, coalesced into one burning point of rage. It flared within her, not chaotic, but sharp, precise. She did not move. She did not speak. Not yet. But her silence was no more extended submission. It was the silence before a storm. Around them, the entire restaurant had frozen. The chandeliers glittered coldly above, as though they too waited. The staff at other tables lingered mid-step, unsure whether to intervene or vanish. The air in Aurelia was dense, heavy with anticipation. Every patron sensed that something extraordinary was about to break. The insult had been thrown, the blow delivered. Now all that remained was to see if the victim would collapse as Cain expected, or if the story would turn in ways he could not control. Victor Cain leaned back, triumphant. His smirk stretched into a smile. He believed the battle was already won, that Elena's humiliation was inevitable. He raised his glass, took a slow sip, and placed it down with the casual confidence of a man convinced of his victory. His companions mirrored his anticipation. Claudia's eyes, sharp with calculation. Miles's grin, eager and cruel. The stage was his, and he waited for Elena to crumble. But Elena Marlowe did not bend. Her hands clasped lightly behind her back, her shoulders straightened with deliberate control. She inhaled the rarefied air of Aurelia, deeply steadying her pulse. She could feel the gaze of the room pressing down on her, the weight of humiliation balanced on the edge of her silence. Her composure did not break. Instead, her eyes lifted, meeting Cain's with a steadiness that startled him. She was not retreating, she was preparing. In that stillness, the dynamic shifted ever so slightly. The billionaire had invited the world to witness her collapse, but the world might be about to witness something else entirely. Elena Marlowe did not tremble. Her heart pounded in her chest like a war drum. Still, her hands remained steady, clasped behind her back. The insult Victor Cain had thrown was designed to strip her down to nothing, a final blow meant to reduce her to silence. Yet in that silence, she discovered not defeat, but clarity. The years of study, the late nights in libraries, the poetry she had translated, the culture she had absorbed, all of it surged forward like a tide waiting for release. She drew in one long, deliberate breath, and when she spoke, her voice was transformed. It was not the clipped, polite tone of a waitress trained to soothe egos. Her voice was resonant, fluid, alive with confidence. It came not in English, but in French, the flawless Parisian French of someone who had lived inside the language, not merely studied it. The words were liquid and melodic, rolling from her tongue with the authority of scholarship and love. The restaurant froze. A fork slipped from a patron's hand, landing against porcelain with a muted clink. Still, no one turned to look at the sound. Their eyes were all fixed on Elena. "Monsieur Kane," she began, the syllable soft, yet edged with steel. "Forgive me, but the dish you attempted to order, rognon de veau à la Dijonnaise, is not merely a line on a menu. It is a fragment of history from Burgundy, a poem composed in flavors." Her gaze never left his, and the power of that gaze made him falter. His smirk thinned as though carved away by her calm precision. She did not stop. She pressed forward, describing the preparation with eloquence. Kidneys seared quickly in clarified butter to seal the outside. Tender within the sauce, deglazed with white wine and rich with crème fraîche, balanced by the sharp bite of old-style mustard. Every word rose higher, not in volume, but in intensity. The staff had stopped mid-step. The chef peered from the kitchen door, frozen. The manager, Laurent, had halted across the dining room, his face betraying shock. The dining room was no longer a theater for Kane's cruelty. It had become Elena's lecture hall.
Kane was her unwilling student. She spoke of the terroir of the land of Burgundy, of the rustic yet demanding finesse of the dish. Her words did more than correct his mispronunciation. They revealed the culture he tried to wield as an ornament, as something more profound than his wealth could touch. The air around the table thickened. Kane sat rigid, his face draining of its usual ruddy bravado. The confidence that had carried him collapsed under the weight of her knowledge. Each syllable she uttered widened the chasm between wealth and class, between possessing money and possessing understanding. Claudia lowered her phone completely, her sculpted face alight with surprise. For the first time that evening, her gaze on her husband was not admiration or dependence, but sharp, cool assessment. Miles Rowan's sycophantic grin vanished, replaced with open disbelief. He looked between Kane and Elena as though the axis of his world had shifted. Elena finished with precision, letting the final French syllables linger in the air like a perfectly sustained musical note. "Perhaps, monsieur," she concluded, her tone courteous yet unyielding, "you would prefer that I ask the chef to ensure the balance of the sauce suits your palate? Or perhaps you might find something simpler, less nuanced, more to your taste." The dagger of her words was sheathed in politeness, but everyone in the room heard its edge. The insult he had cast upon her had returned, sharpened, magnified, and delivered in front of an audience he could not control. The silence that followed was profound. The chandeliers glittered above like witnesses. The wealthy patrons who had turned to watch did not look away now. They stared, frozen statues, in a tableau of humiliation. Victor Kane sat, diminished. His expensive suit hung loosely as though it no longer fit. His face pale, his eyes wide, his mouth slightly open as though words had abandoned him. For a man who fed on dominance, silence was his starvation, and Elena had delivered it with elegance. She remained standing, poised, unshaken, though her pulse still hammered. She had not raised her voice, she had not begged, she had reclaimed the dignity he had tried to steal, and in doing so had revealed the hollowness of his power. The mogul who had humiliated others for sport had been undone, not by rage or force, but by knowledge, by culture, by class. The dining room held its breath, unwilling to break the spell. The first to move. She lowered her eyes, not to her phone, but to her husband. Her raised eyebrows, her faint smirk, spoke of shifting tides. Miles swallowed hard, the sycophancy curdling into panic. His master had been cut down in public. He had no script for this. Victor Kane remained rigid, his fingers twitching against the table, his jaw clenched. He had wanted laughter. He had wished to fear. Instead, he had been silenced by brilliance. Elena stepped back slightly, her body still composed. She felt the burn of adrenaline coursing through her veins, but she refused to let it shake her. She had not planned this.
She had not rehearsed it, but when the moment arrived, she had chosen not to bow. She had decided to stand, and in that instant she was no longer invisible, not to Cain, not to Aurelia, not to anyone. She had claimed her place in the story, a place no insult could erase. The silence that followed Elena Marlowe's words was not empty. Still, thunderous. Every corner of Aurelia seemed to vibrate with it. The chandeliers glimmered overhead, casting fractured light across faces frozen in disbelief. The air was thick with the weight of what had just unfolded. A billionaire used to bending grooms to his will had been dismantled by a waitress armed with nothing but intellect and poise. It was a reversal so complete that even the walls seemed to hold their breath.
Doret Victor Cain sat merige in the sea. Crimson of arrogance had drained from his face, leaving him pale. His fingers twitched against the polished wood of the table, as if searching for something to grip. His eyes remained fixed on Elena, wide with the disbelief of a man who had always assumed himself untouchable. He had expected submission, and instead found defiance wrapped in eloquence. For the first time in years, words had abandoned him. Claudia studied him closely. Her posture straightened, her head tilted slightly to one side. Her expression was not the practiced boredom of earlier, but a cool appraisal. For years she had tolerated his bluster because wealth had insulated her. Still now she saw him exposed, not as a titan, but as a man undone by knowledge. He could not command. For a brief moment her lips parted in the faintest of smiles, sharp and cold. Miles Ruan, on the other hand, looked like a man whose world had tipped. He shifted uncomfortably, his eager grin replaced by a sickened gape. He had no lines to recite, no script to follow. His master had been struck and he could not shield him. Elena stood still, her back straight, her eyes unflinching. Her pulse thundered in her ears, but she refused to betray a tremor. Her training told her to look away, to retreat. Still, she held Cain's gaze until its weight became unbearable, and he shifted his eyes downward. The shift was slight, but it was enough. The room noticed it. The predator lowered his head, and the hunted emerged victor. From the doorway, the chef stood frozen, spatula still in hand, as though the kitchen had paused.
The manager, Laurent, had halted mid-stride, his sharp eyes narrowed, not with anger, but with astonishment. He had managed Aurelia long enough to see countless humiliations, whispered slights, and veiled cruelties, but never had he witnessed one so directly inverted. Naomi Marlowe had turned the script upside down. The audience of New York's elite had seen it happen. The diners reacted in waves. At one table, an older man in a tailored suit raised his brows, murmuring to his companion. At another, a woman covered her mouth with a hand, hiding a smile. Some watched with discomfort, unwilling to side openly against a mogul, others with delight, savoring the rare sight of power humbled. The whispers began to ripple like a tide, careful at first, then bolder. Each retelling of the moment seemed to grow even as the event itself still hung suspended in the air. Elena felt the adrenaline shift from fire to ice. Her body trembled, though she forced the motion inward. She had defended herself brilliantly, but at what cost? The cardinal rule of service had been broken. Never make a guest feel small. And she had not just made a guest small. She had reduced one of the city's loudest billionaires to silence before an entire room of witnesses. The gravity of that truth pressed on her chest like stone. Cain's jaw clenched. His breath came in shallow bursts. His pride was bleeding in public, and the wound could not be hidden. He reached for his glass, his hand shaking ever so slightly. He raised it to his lips, but the wine did not steady him. He had been toppled, and he knew it. Worse, everyone else knew it too. Claudia's faint smile cut deeper than Elena's lecture. Miles's stammering silence
screamed louder than applause. Every pair of eyes around him reflected his fall. Elena stepped back from the table, her composure intact but her mind a storm. She had chosen dignity over submission, but dignity did not pay hospital bills. She thought of her mother lying under fluorescent hospital lights. She thought of rent due and debts unpaid. She wondered if her act of defiance would be worth the price that was surely coming. Her chest tightened with fear, but she would not let it show. Not here, not now. Laurent finally crossed the dining room with long, controlled strides. His face gave nothing away. Still, his arrival confirmed what everyone knew. The spectacle could not continue. He inclined his head toward Elena, his voice low but firm. "Mademoiselle Parker, my office, please." The use of her name, formal and public, cut through the silence. Kane's eyes lit with renewed malice. He had lost the battle, but he could still win the war. Elena nodded once tightly. She turned on her heel and walked through the restaurant. Each step felt heavier than the last. The eyes of every diner followed her. A young woman at a small corner table lowered her glasses, meeting Elena's gaze with the slightest nod, a signal of respect. Elena barely registered it. Her thoughts had already leapt ahead to the confrontation waiting behind Laurent's office door. Victor Kane remained slumped in his chair, his face mottled with rage and humiliation. Claudia finally lifted her phone again. But this time, she did not scroll. She took one long, unblinking look at her husband before returning her attention to the screen. Miles whispered something desperate to fill the void, but Kane did not hear him. He was already plotting retribution, already imagining ways to crush the woman who had dared to make him look small. The dining room exhaled slowly, the atmosphere shifting back into motion, but altered forever. The staff resumed their movements. Plates were cleared and glasses refilled, yet the memory lingered. The night had changed. Aurelia was no longer just a sanctuary for wealth. It had become the stage of an unmasking, and every patron knew they would leave with a story. A billionaire had tried to humiliate the server and instead had been dismantled before them all. The question now was not what had happened, but what would come next. Elena Marlowe sat in the small chair of the manager's office, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The confrontation had ended, but the echoes still rang inside her skull. Laurent had been stern, his voice weighted with the authority of years running Aurelia. He told her that Kane's fury was not something to be dismissed, that she had crossed a line that no server should ever cross. But behind the reprimand there had been a glimmer of something else: respect. He had suspended her for 2 weeks, not fired her. His words had been both punishment and protection, and as she stepped out of the restaurant into the cold Manhattan night, Elena felt both dread and relief. What she did not know was that her story had already left the walls of Aurelia. A woman at a corner table had watched the entire scene with sharp, intelligent eyes. Her name was Isabelle Delaine, a journalist who wrote for a cultural magazine known for its long narrative pieces. She was not a gossip writer. She did not chase scandal. She sought stories about people, about dignity and hidden truths. And what she had witnessed was not simply a clash between a mogul and a waitress, but a parable about class power and the value of knowledge. Isabelle paid her bill in cash, her mind already working through the structure of the article. She left the restaurant not thinking about the flavors she had just tasted, but about the opening sentence that would carry her story into the world. The city's air hit her face, brisk and cold,
but she barely noticed. She hurried to her Brooklyn apartment, filled with stacks of books and a desk scattered with drafts of half-finished stories. That night, she began to write. Her piece was titled The Menu. It opened not with an accusation, but with a question. What is the actual cost of a luxury meal? She painted Aurelia as a temple to wealth, described its chandeliers and hushed reverence. She created archetypes rather than names: the mogul, the scholar, the sycophant, and the trophy wife. The mogul's cruelty was laid bare in every detail. His smirk, his booming voice, his deliberate mispronunciation of French dishes. The scholar's quiet dignity unfolded in contrast, her patience, her hidden intellect, and finally her devastating response that turned humiliation into revelation. Isabel wrote with precision. She did not quote directly, but captured the rhythm of the dialogue. She described the mogul's cutting remark. "I doubt she can even read the menu." Not as a simple insult, but as the climax of an evening built on petty cruelties. She explained why the reply, in flawless French, had been so devastatingly effective. It was not merely a correction, but a lesson, a reminder that culture cannot be purchased like a watch or a skyscraper. It must be lived and understood. Published a week later, it appeared not in the food section, but on the front page of the Culture and Society vertical. Readers did not encounter a restaurant review. They encountered a story about invisible lives, about the dignity of labor and the imbalance of power in spaces like Aurelia. The anonymity of the subjects made it sharper. It was not just about one waitress, one billionaire. It was about every server who had ever been mocked, every worker who had ever been dismissed by wealth. Internet seized on it. Social media platforms lit up. Twitter was flooded with comments from service workers. "You can feel her strength in those words. This has to be someone on the Upper East Side." Facebook spread the story among readers who rarely thought about what happened behind their wine glasses. LinkedIn posts appeared with executives debating what authentic leadership and respect looked like. Podcasts referenced it. Morning news shows picked it up. The piece had struck a nerve. Inside Aurelia, the staff whispered reading the article on their phones between shifts. Some recognized Elena in the unnamed scholar. Others were careful not to say her name, but pride flickered behind their silence. George, the veteran waiter who had warned her about Kane, shook his head with a grin. "She did it," he muttered to a colleague. "She actually did it." For Victor Kane, the article was poison. He sat in his office at the top of his glass tower, staring at the words that described him too perfectly for comfort. The mogul, loud and insecure, wielded wealth as a weapon. The world speculated on his identity. His PR director rushed into action, urging him to respond. Still, Kane felt the humiliation tighten like a vice. His empire had been built on dominance, and the narrative suddenly shifted. He was no longer a titan, but a caricature. Elena, meanwhile, sat in her small queen's apartment, caring for her mother, unaware of how wide the ripples had spread. She had chosen dignity over silence, but she had not chosen fame. She was frightened of the consequences, worried about her job, worried about the bills, worried about what Kane might do. But as she held her mother's frail hand one evening, she heard her whisper, "You looked troubled, my love. You must never sell your brilliance." That was the truth Elena clung to. Even as the city buzzed with her anonymous story, even as the storm gathered around Kane, she knew that moment had not been for the world. It had been for herself. The days of suspension stretched into a strange quiet for Elena Marlowe. Her apartment in Queens felt smaller than ever, the walls pressing in with the weight of uncertainty. Each morning she rose early, brewed coffee, and sat by the window, staring at the city skyline in the distance. Her hands longed for the familiar rhythm of trays and glasses, but her mind was restless. The article, the menu, had gone everywhere. She saw its echoes on social media, but she avoided reading too much, afraid of finding her own reflection in the scholar described anonymously. The silence gave her space to breathe, but also space to doubt. Neglected, her mother was her anchor. She spent the afternoons in the hospital, sitting beside the frail woman who had once filled their home with books and laughter. Machines hummed in the sterile room, their beeps and whirs measuring out each fragile moment. Elena read aloud sometimes, passages of French poetry they both loved. Her mother's smile, however faint, reminded her why she had endured the door many
Humiliation of serving the arrogant and wealthy. Yet at night, when she returned home and counted the bills on her kitchen table, fear always crept in. How much longer could she keep the balance? One morning, her phone chimed with an email notification. She opened it and froze. The sender was Dr. William Harrington, her former professor, the mentor she had called with trembling hands a year earlier to tell him she was withdrawing from the doctoral program. The subject line read, "A long shot, but is this you?" Her chest tightened as she read the words. He had attached the article, the menu, noting the precision of the scholar's French, the references to Burgundy, the unmistakable signs of a student he once knew. He asked gently if it had been her, and then continued with news of an opportunity of Lyon, in partnership with her old institution, had launched the Madeleine Dubois Fellowship, a 2-year research post fully funded, offering full access to French archives. Harrington admitted the deadline had technically passed. Still, as a selection committee member, he could ensure her application would be considered if she could send materials by the end of the week. His words closed with encouragement. "Talent like yours is rare, Elena. It would be a tragedy not to see it flourish again." She read the email 3 times. Her throat burned with unshed tears. Hope flickered again, dangerous and dazzling. Meliors, as she clutched the lifeline, another shadow fell. Across the room, her voicemail light blinked red. She pressed play. A calm, professional voice filled the air. "Miss Marlowe, my name is Cynthia Lowell, Executive Vice President of Communications for Beaumont Enterprises. Mr. Victor Kane has asked to meet with you. He is prepared to make you a very generous offer. Please return my call at your earliest convenience." The voice was smooth, measured, corporate. Still, the message was unmistakable. He had found her. Elena sat frozen, the phone still pressed to her ear. A cold wave of dread washed over her. The man who had tried to break her in front of an entire restaurant was now extending an invitation. It did not feel like generosity. It felt like the first touch of a web spun by a spider. She placed the phone down slowly, as though it might bite. The contrast between the 2 messages, one from her professor and one from Kane, crystallized into 2 paths before her. One path glittered with money and security. Kane could erase her debts in a single gesture. He could place her mother in the best private care. No more sterile corridors, no more gnawing fear of bills. The temptation was really heavy and suffocating. A future where every financial nightmare vanished was no small offer. She could almost imagine herself breathing freely for the first time in years. The other path was narrower, steeper, and filled with uncertainty. It offered no guarantee of wealth, only the promise of purpose. The fellowship in Lyon meant long hours in archives, meant living modestly in a foreign city, meant choosing scholarship over security. It was a return to the life she had once dreamed of, but feared she could no longer afford. It was not comfort, but authenticity. It was not luxury, but truth. That night, she sat at her mother's bedside, the choice pressing against her chest like a weight. Her mother's hand felt fragile in her own. Her mother looked at her with tired but Nia she understood then that Cain did not wish to reward her brilliance. He wanted to purchase it, package it, parade it to cleanse his own image. His offer was not salvation, but a transaction. The email from Harrington was not merely an opportunity. It was a reminder of who she truly was. A scholar, a thinker, a daughter of a woman who had given her books instead of jewels. She knew she could not avoid the meeting with Cain. Still, she also knew she would not go to accept his money, which could save her today, but it would bury her tomorrow. For 2 nights, she let the voicemail remain untouched. A serpent coiled in her inbox. She printed Harrington's email, kept it beside her bed, reading it before sleep as if it were a prayer. 2 voices haunted her, one promising gold and comfort, the other urging her toward truth. The city outside roared with indifference, but in Elena's small apartment, the battle of her life was being fought. She now stood at the threshold of decision, one path leading into a gilded cage, the other into the uncertain open sky. The morning of the meeting dawned grey and sharp, the kind of New York day when the air itself seemed to carry judgment. Elena Marlowe rose early, her movements precise, deliberate. She chose her outfit with care, not the black uniform that had once made her invisible, but a charcoal dress that whispered of quiet authority. Over her shoulders, she placed her mother's old tweed blazer, worn but dignified, a relic from another life. It was a uniform of a different kind, not for serving, but for standing firm. She studied herself in the mirror, her reflection calmer than the storm twisting in her chest. This was not a job interview. This was a reckoning. The subway ride into Manhattan felt like a passage between worlds. The rumbling train filled with weary faces from every corner of the globe delivered her into the canyons of glass and steel that Cain had built for himself. His tower rose above them all, a jagged monument of smoked glass stabbing into the sky. It was not beautiful. It was imposing. Its purpose not to inspire but to dominate. The lobby echoed with the footsteps of power, its black marble floors polished to a sheen that reflected her image at her small but unbroken. Cynthia Lowell waited near the elevator bank, poised in her tailored suit. Her smile was professional, practiced, warm enough to disarm but cold in her eyes. "Miss Marlowe, thank you for coming. Mr. Cain is very much looking forward to this." She guided Elena into the elevator and pressed a button that sent them rising swiftly toward the heights of wealth. The car was silent save for the hum of machinery. The air grew thinner as they ascended. Elena steadied her breathing, her fingers brushing the rough weave of her mother's blazer, as if to draw strength from it. The boardroom was a cathedral of corporate ambition. Vast walls of glass framed the skyline so that the city itself seemed to kneel at Cain's feet. A single table stretched its length, polished obsidian gleaming under sterile light. At its far end, Victor Cain stood, waiting like a king on his throne. He wore his wealth as armor, a suit cut to perfection, a watch gleaming at his wrist. His voice was smooth, rehearsed, as he extended a hand. "Miss Marlowe, thank you for coming. Please sit." Elena chose a chair several seats away, placing distance between them. She set her bag on the floor, her hands steady on the cool surface of the table. She met his gaze without flinching. "I will get straight to the point," he said, leaning forward, his baritone carefully calibrated. "What happened at the restaurant was unfortunate, a misunderstanding. I have a gruff way about me. I expect the best.
Sometimes my passion comes out sideways. The words were familiar, a non-apology wrapped in excuses.
Yelena recognized them for what they were. He was not sorry. He was rearranging the narrative to suit. His voice swelled with self-satisfaction, certain he had